Guys, what is going on? All right, as promised, we're going to go into the dating of the Gospels and things of this nature. Um, First thing we're going to start out with is what's called the Synoptic Problem. Um, a lot of you have probably never heard of it. So a lot of you probably have by the same token. It is a theory that is accepted by majority of scholarship. I would say probably in the neighborhood of 70 to 80% of scholars accept this. Once again, you will find evangelicals as the usually lone redactors of this theory. Um, and don't let it fool you. The synoptic problem is not so much that it's a problem, it's just something that causes questions to be raised and brings another level of understanding to what we have to know about the Gospels and how to date them and this, that, and the other. So I was originally going to read this straight out of the Yale Bible Dictionary, but it was much longer and convoluted. I found two sources on the internet, one by Felix Just, PhD, that was a lot more concise. The Yale Bible Dictionary goes on a lot. And I found another post on this problem by uh, I think it came from Stephen C. Carson and Mark Goodacre. I'm not sure. And then clearly listed. But anyway, it will give you all the information you need to know about what is the synoptic problem and why it's relevant to understanding certain things within the Bible. So we'll start off. The Synoptic Gospels. The Gospels, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are so similar to each other that, in a sense, they view Jesus with the same eye, hence the word synoptic. In contrast to the very different picture of Jesus presented in the fourth Gospel, or the non-canonical Gospels. Yet there are also many significant differences among the three Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Problem. The similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so numerous and so close, not just in the order of the material presented, but also in the exact wording of long stretches of text, that it is not sufficient to explain these similarities on the basis of common oral tradition alone. Rather, some type of literary dependence must be assumed as well. That is, someone copied from someone else's previously written text. Several of the evangelists must have used one or more of the earlier Gospels as a source for their own compositions. The situation is complicated because some of the materials in common to all three synoptics, while other materials only found in two of these three Gospels. Moreover, the common material is not always presented in the same order in the various Gospels. So the question remains, who wrote first and who copied from whom? And the older proposals, and we'll talk a little bit about each of these in a minute, you have the traditional theory, also known as the Augustinian hypothesis, and that is he put Matthew as the source for Mark, and Mark and Matthew were the source for Luke. You had the Griesbach theory, also known as the two gospel hypothesis, which the Gospel of Matthew was used to write Luke, and Luke and Matthew were used to write Mark. Then you had the Ferrier-Golder theory, or Goulder theory, also known as positing Markan priority theory. Mark comes first. He's used to write Matthew, and them together are used to write Luke. The four-source theory is a solution accepted by most scholars today. The four-source theory, aka the two-document hypothesis from B.H. Streeter. Mark is the oldest written gospel which provided the narrative framework for both Matthew and Luke. Q, and we will get to these things too in later videos, Q is a hypothetical written source of some sayings and teachings of Jesus now lost. And remember, at one time they thought they didn't have anything like that, and then they came up with the Gospel of Thomas. So it is not completely far-fetched. M, various other materials, mostly oral, some of them may have been written, found only in Matthew. L, various other materials, mostly oral, others probably written, found only in Luke. The arrows on this chart that you can't see direct the influence. So basically what happens is you have Mark influencing Matthew and Luke. The other main pillar is Q, which influences Matthew and Luke. And then you have outside tradition coming into Matthew and outside tradition coming into Luke. Okay? Mark and priority. For most of Christian history, people thought that Matthew was the first and oldest gospel and that Mark was a later, shorter version of the same basic message. From the mid-19th century until today, however, most scholars are convinced that Mark is the first and oldest Gospels, at least in the final version that we have today, and that Matthew and Luke are later expansions of Mark. Why? 1. Mark's Gospel contains several grammatical, literary, historical, and geographical difficulties or minor errors that are not found in Matthew and or Luke. If Matthew was first, it is harder to understand how Mark could have introduced these errors. But if Mark was first, it is easy to see how Matthew and Luke wanted them to be able to correct Mark's minor mistakes. 2. Mark's Gospel contains several episodes that are obscure. Chapter 4, 26 through 29, and chapter 14, 15, 51 through 52. Or make Jesus look crazy. Excuse me. Chapter 3, verses 19 through 21, magical. Chapter 7, 32 through 37, or weak. Chapter 8, 23 through 26. If Matthew was first, it is harder to explain why Mark added these strange episodes, but if Mark was first, it is easy to understand why both Mark and Luke omitted them. 3. Mark's basic chronological geographical structure is the same as the other two synoptics, but the material found in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, is in very different orders from these two Gospels. If Matthew was first and Mark was second, it is hard to understand why Luke would have kept the same order for all the material found in both Matthew and Mark, but substantially rearrange all the other material found in Matthew and not in Mark. If Mark was first, however, then it is easy to explain. Matthew and Luke inserted the extra material they have in common from the hypothetical Q source into Mark's overall outline, although in significantly different ways. Note that scholars who believe Mark was historically first do not suggest that the order of the four Gospels in the New Testament should be changed. There is no reason why the traditional order of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John cannot be retained in printed Bibles. However, in textbook and academic works, many scholars treat Mark first, followed by Matthew and Luke, and John is usually still last. Objections against the Q hypothesis. Some scholars object to the hypothesis of a no longer extant collection of sayings and teachings of Jesus as the Q document is thought to have been, for various reasons, but each of these objections can easily be countered. 1. Objection. The Q document no longer exists. If it ever did. Response. If almost all the material in Q was incorporated into Matthew or Luke's Gospels, then early Christians would have little need or desire to preserve Q as a separate document. When people find a revised or expanded edition of a work, they don't always keep the older, shorter edition. Rather than wondering why Q is lost, it would be more important to ask why Mark was preserved. 2. Objection. No early Christians would have composed a collection of sayings and teachings of Jesus, such as Q supposedly was, like the sayings of Confucius or the sayings of Chairman Mao, without also including some stories of his miracles and other actions, and his passion, death, and resurrection. Response. The non-canonical Gospel of Thomas, rediscovered in 1948, is a collection of 114 sayings, parables, and short teachings of Jesus that does not include any miracles or other stories and events in Jesus' life. Although the Gospel of Thomas is not the same as Q, its contents are significantly different. It is proof that early Christians did indeed compose the same type of genre of literature that the Q document seems to have been. Objection number 3. The Q hypothesis is not necessary for explaining the relationship among the three synoptic Gospels. Response. All the other solutions that try to solve the synoptic problem without positing a Q document have their own significant problems. The details are too complex to be discussed on this webpage, but are available in many textbook and scholarly works. Although we should remember that the past existence of a Q document is only a hypothesis, it is not a proven fact. It does seem to provide the best solution for explaining the synoptic problem. It does have the strongest leg of explanatory power of any of the objections that I have read. The preservation and canonization of Mark. Given that Mark's gospel is so short and has several difficulties, it is interesting to ask why Mark was not lost, but rather was accepted into the New Testament canon. There are at least three reasons why Mark was preserved and canonized despite its shortcomings. One, Mark was the secretary or interpreter of Peter. See Pius as quoted by Eusebius. So in a way, the gospel according to Mark could be thought of as Peter's gospel. And since Peter was the leader among the apostles, early Christians would have good reason to preserve what they considered to be a record of his preaching. 2. Mark's gospel was thought to have been written in Rome and or for the early Christian community in Rome. See Clement of Alexandria, again quoted by Eusebius. So in a sense, Mark's gospels could be considered the gospel of Rome. Not only was the city of Rome the capital of the largest city of the Roman Empire, but the two most important Christian apostles, Peter and Paul, both preached and were martyred there and are buried there. Thus, the Christian community in Rome became prominent and influential very early in Christian history, and it is easy to understand why their gospel would have been preserved. 3. If Markan priority is correct and Mark's was indeed the first gospel to have been written, then it would be the oldest available record of the words and deeds of Jesus. Yet another reason why early Christians might have preserved it and continued to use it despite the brevity and the shortcomings. Okay? And basically he goes on to explain why when people are going to Bible colleges or seminaries, they'll have them highlight passages as they go in different colors to show so the students will know what is shared material, what is not. So that's that article right there. And I will bring you to the second article that will break down some of these theories a little bit better for you. And I'll just skip his intro and go straight to it. Because there is still debate regarding the synoptic problem, the major solution theories will be considered below. 1. The traditional Augustinian theory. This theory suggests that Matthew was the first gospel to be composed, followed by Mark, then Luke. The second and third gospels relied on the previous gospels as sources. Some view a preservation of Matthean priority as essential because of certain statements by the early church fathers. One of those statements came from Augustine, who said that the evangelists have written in this order: first Matthew, then Mark, third Luke, and last John. Both Irenaeus and Origen, predecessors of Augustine, also held to the same order of composition. Later advocates of this theory include Hugo Grotius, H.G. Jameson, Basil Christopher Butler, and John Wyndham. 2. The two gospel hypothesis, the Griesbach theory. Like the traditional Augustinian theory, the Griesbach theory also maintains Matthean priority. Unlike the previous theory, however, the two gospel hypothesis holds Luke being the second gospel and then Mark as the third. Luke would have used Matthew as a source, and then Mark would have used Matthew and Luke as sources. Again, Matthean priority finds support in the church fathers. It was Clement of Alexandria who wrote that the Gospels, with genealogies, which would have been Matthew and Luke, were written first. Some of the main contributors to this theory are Henry Owen, J.J. Griesbach, William R. Farmer, and T.R.W. Longstaff. On the other hand, there are problems with Matthean priority. It is evident that Mark's Gospels is the shortest, and the majority of it is also found in Matthew and Luke. It is difficult to explain why the shortest Gospel is only about 10% original, especially when there is so much support of it being Peter's interpretation through Mark. If indeed Mark was the abridgment of Matthew and Luke, it also would be hard to give an account for the deletion of significant points that are found in the two Gospels, e.g. the birth of Christ and the Sermon on the Mount. Moreover, many of the earliest quotes supporting Matthean priority also state it was written in a Hebrew dialect or Aramaic. Consequently, these quotes do not require Matthean priority in the Greek text, which allow possibilities for Markan or Lucan priority. Two-source theory. Undoubtedly, this theory has become the most widely accepted theory amongst New Testament scholars today. The reason for its popularity is that it settles the problems that arise with Matthean priority, while confronting the difficulty of the double tradition. Under the two-source theory, the priority is given to Mark. Both Matthew and Luke separately used Mark as a source. Matthew reproduces the vast majority of Mark, while Luke also incorporates more than half. In addition to using Mark as a source, Matthew and Luke also used a common source called Q. Defining Q. The letter Q is short for the German word Quell, which means source or spring. Q can actually refer to a few different things. It could be a tangible first century document, parts of various first century documents, oral traditions, or just a double tradition material that's found both in Matthew and Luke. Many different hypotheses have been made concerning Q, because there is no tangible proof that such a document existed outside of the double tradition. One of the only areas of consensus regarding Q is that it antedates both Matthew and Luke. Q would also be a sayings gospel. Unlike the Gospels of the New Testament, Q would not contain narrative sections because the Q material in both Matthew and Luke are sometimes placed in different contexts. Q remains a hypothesis, though, and until there is weightier evidence, it is only one of the few solutions. It is only one of the few solutions to the synoptic problem. Three-source theory. The less popular three-source theory is very similar to the two-source theory except in one respect. Mark and priority and the use of Q are both retained, but the difference between the two and the three-source theory holds that to a Matthean influence on Luke. Thus Mark was written first, then Matthew, then Luke, with Matthew and Luke using the previous Gospels as a source in addition to Q. Most scholars see this as improbable because the idea of Luke using Matthew seems to contradict the reasons for the development of Q. Four-source theory. This theory is based on and has all the elements of two-source theory in addition to Matthew and Luke independently using Mark and Q. They each used material that was distinctive to themselves. The material that is inclusive in Matthew is called M, and Luke's material is called the L tradition. Since this is just a form of the two-source theory, this is also heavily favored among scholars. The Farrier theory, Mark without Q. The last theory that will be discussed here is commonly called the Farrier theory. Like all the previous few theories, the Farrier theory gives priority to Mark. Matthew was the second to be composed, followed by Luke. Matthew would have used Mark, while Luke would have used Mark and Matthew. This theory eliminates the need for a theoretical Q based on the triple tradition, and the double tradition are explained without the need of an outside source. The leading supporters of this theory include J.H. Ropes, A.M. Farrier, M.D. Golder, and Mark Goodacre. The advantage of the Farrier theory is that it seems to solve the synoptic problem without the use of hypothetical external documents. So there's just a look at, just getting into all this issue as we start to look at all the Gospels and their pieces. That is the two-source theory and a brief explanation of Q. And I may not do a video on Q if, it's just important to remember it's a document of necessity, okay? It could have been oral, it could have been written, but it's the explanation of the material that are found in two of the Gospels and them being identical. So that material is attributed to Q. That's just how they've chosen to identify it. So that's it on that one. God bless.